This is DBrief, brought to you by the Australian Industry Group.
Hello, and welcome to this series of special episodes of AI Group's DBrief podcast. DBrief is designed to give you insights into the impact of policy on your business. In these mini episodes, we'll be talking about the kinds of policies we want to see for members in the upcoming federal election. My name is Louise McGrath, Head of Industry Development and Policy at AI Group. Today I have Kate Lewis, Executive Director of AI Group's Defence Council, to talk about her pre-election paper. Welcome, Kate.
Hello, Louise. Thanks very much for having me.
Kate, for a long time, defence industry policy has been a stand-in for industry policy, particularly among state governments. But without wanting to sound alarmist, today we are operating in a different framework. Just articulate the current strategic situation Australia is facing.
Thanks, Louise. That's a really important question and important for framing the rest of our discussion. I'd probably start, at the 2020 strategic update. So prior to that, Defence in Australia had been operating under the assumption that we had a 10-year warning time before we would need to prepare for a conventional attack on Australia. So the 2020 Defence Strategic Update told us that warning time had effectively evaporated and that we needed to have much more urgency in our capability planning and acquisition. Since then, of course, we've had more recent developments with the current government saying that we are in the most dangerous strategic circumstances since the Second World War. And of course, we have the terrible conflict in Russia, Ukraine. And just more recently and closer to home, we've had the Chinese flotilla circumnavigating Australia with issues raised about our own ability to track the flotilla. And we have very interesting developments occurring in the US policy world, economically specifically, but with strategic implications as well. So all of that put together is a dangerous operating and strategic environment for Australia with very important implications for defence policymakers and indeed the industrial base.
And you mentioned the US, and certainly they're pushing back on funding levels from their traditional allies and within NATO. And some cynics might say that there's always enough money for war. But are we confident that we've got the right defence funding levels in Australia?
Look, it's a great question. So currently funding levels in the Australian defence budget sit around $55 billion a year, or just over 2% of GDP. Now, that sounds like a lot of money, and it is a lot of money, particularly in the context of the federal election and other pressures on the budget that will occur. However, AI Group analysis, which we have undertaken recently, really demonstrates how much pressure the defence budget is under in order to undertake the types of acquisitions and to have the operating ADF that we need. Specifically, there are a couple of really big pressures that are identifiable. First of all, I would point to the nuclear-powered submarine and the acquisition of that in that program, which has a tremendous, and it's a really huge step-up change in not only the capability that we will receive, but the funding required, not just in defence, of course, but across the whole national budget. And indeed, as an indicator, we have will be putting around $9 billion into the industrial bases of the US and the UK to support that, as well as our own domestic requirements. So that is a very significant pressure on the defence budget. In addition to that, we have seen in recent years the effects of inflation, the effects of huge increases required just to keep the lights on in defence in terms of the estate budget, workforce. And the government has also had a real focus on reducing over-programming as well, which has trying to release some pressure on the budget. Over-programming is where you put additional projects into your investment plan in the realisation that there will be, because of the complexity of defence projects, some of them will slip. So with defence really trying to bring that level of over-programming down with the cumulative effects of inflation, estate, workforce and so forth, what we've seen is a really big impact in the short term on the acquisition and sustainment budgets, which of course not only affects defence capability, but the industrial base.
And is there a risk, though, in reducing that over-programming? I mean, I can imagine, of course it's a risk to have it in there because it raises expectations, but as you say, not all projects go ahead. And so if we don't have enough plan Bs, so to speak, does it potentially leave us short if too many of the plan As fail?
Yeah, it's a great question. So over-programming has always been kind of both an art and a science, and has been around for many years. And getting that level right is really important because you need enough projects in your pipeline to continue to keep going with your acquisition and continue to equip the ADF with the services and with the capability it needs. But of course, if you have too much over-programming, you can't deliver what you need to. So there's kind of a fine balance there. I think what we've seen recently with the government is a really large package of acquisitions have been either delayed or taken out of the investment program. Now, I think it's important to point out, Louise, that we understand and respect that governments need to make hard decisions. They need to prioritise, they need to make difficult decisions. And you can argue every day of the week about which capabilities are more important than others. But we have seen a big capability acquisition package reduced or cut in the last couple of years, which have included a reduction in the number of Hunter frigates, for example, OPVs, the infantry fighting vehicles have been reduced significantly in terms of land combat, and mine countermeasures, and 2 replenishment ships. So that, in effect, is a large capability acquisition package. Now, to be fair, it is a complex argument because some other things have been brought forward and some other things have been included in the plan, including the general purpose frigates. So it's a complex plan and it's not easy to describe it in a couple of sentences. However, overall, the picture, and something that AI Group is very focused on, is whether the funding requirements now, with the additional pressures of the submarine, with the additional pressures of inflation, estate, workforce, etc., are sufficient to meet what the government needs in terms of those strategic requirements and the capability the ADF needs.
And as you say, inflation and all the other usual pressures that affect all businesses will also affect defence. They don't operate in their own special economic ocean. And a common theme in all our policy papers this year has been the need for a skilled workforce. And I think defence isn't, immune from that. And particularly around that 3D transition, the digitalisation, decarbonisation, diversification, though in this case we'll say there's a 4th D being defence. What can a new government do to ensure we meet the emerging workforce needs of a defence industry?
So I'd probably begin answering this question by saying it's pretty much the number one issue that members raise with me very frequently is the need for that sustainable talent pipeline coming through. So the need is absolutely unquestionable, especially with the submarine program coming through, which will have tremendous workforce requirements. So our really strong suggestion is for the development of a national defence workforce strategy. There has been recently the development, and this government actually set up the Maritime Workforce and Skills Council, which from reports to me is quite a successful model. So one of our suggestions also is to replicate that model, maybe grow it and provide some industry leadership, but grow it not just out of the maritime sector, but more nationally and across different defence sectors. So it's important to get that pipeline of workforce right from the education system through into the workforce. And anything that we do, of course, needs to be within existing architecture of the Jobs and Skills Council, etc., Australia, and so forth, rather than just being a completely unique organisation.
Yeah. And so, as you say, it's not just about the Defence Force having the right skills sort of in-house, not just about the primes, but the entire supply chain. We lift everyone together.
That's exactly right. And certainly there are a lot of conversations about making sure that that workforce is flexible and have the opportunities to work both in defence and the defence industry and build that whole ecosystem.
And Kate, last year you and the team worked with ANU to produce this excellent report, which is of course available on our website, into what's required to build our industrial base. So beyond the skills, but just how do we ensure we have that industrial base to ready us for this new strategic environment, and in particular what the overarching strategy is. So what are the main points we'd hope the new government will embrace?
Thanks for that question, Louise. Yeah, it was a really great experience to work with ANU, and we produced our report titled Defence Industry in National Defence, which you can indeed find on our website. And effectively, it argues that we need a fundamental rethink of Australian defence policy, given the nature of the threats that we were facing and that we discussed a bit earlier. It argues that defence industry shouldn't just be an input to capability, but should actually be seen as a national capability in its own right. So at the moment, our defence industry policy is reflected in the Defence Industry Development Strategy, released last year, and it's kind of an iteration of previous policies, which has a great bunch of initiatives to try to kind of lift the industrial base. There's grant programs. There was some good work done to try to define and narrow the sovereign development industry priorities and so forth. But really our report argues that that kind of approach is still piecemeal. We don't still have a very good understanding of our defence industrial base and what it looks like and what it should look like as an end goal in order to meet the threats that we're facing, in order to have that, importantly, have that surge capacity in the time of conflict. So we had some recommendations in that report that I would commend to you, including that considering Australian defence industry as a capability in its own right, embedding and managing defence industry as part of Australia's broader national industry structure and policy, prioritising and supporting defence industries to achieve scale and surge capabilities, to use the full range of policy levers at government's disposal to shape defence industry outcomes. And we also suggested to manage at the strategic level by appointing a defence industry capability manager. So they were kind of the recommendations to really make sure we understand what the industrial base looks like, use all the levers at the government's disposal to ensure that we're treating the industrial base as a strategic asset, in fact, part of our force projection, and not just in some ways an industry like any other.
I think people listening who aren't that familiar with defence would be surprised that there isn't already a capability manager, thinking strategically about where we want to go.
Yes. Well, there are certainly some exceptional people in defence who do a very good job. The head of CASG, the Capability Acquisition Strategic Group. There are also the head in the policy area and industry areas. But I guess this was really about as I say, treating it as a strategic asset and looking at it right across not only just the acquisition areas, of course, but a state across information technology, across security, all those kind of areas connected at a strategic level to get the industry base that we need if we do indeed need to surge for a conflict.
I mean, I think we have the advantage of unfortunately looking at Ukraine and thinking about defence not just as the new toys that you get on day one, but how you sustain sort of the industry across what can be quite a long battle time frame.
That's exactly right. And we're seeing industry more involved in operational areas, in the logistics chain, right across that whole operational domain. So making sure that we have the industrial base that we need to meet our general requirements and our time of conflict, that was really the heart of the report.
Finally, we'd better mention the big submarine in the room, being AUKUS, probably the longest defence podcast so far that hasn't. So it's already made itself felt in the Australian context with recent reforms in the regulatory regime for exports and professionals, and I know, Kate, you've been on the front line trying to have a bit of a sense check on that as we navigate our way. But are we focused enough on leveraging Australian capability in the delivery of this critical investment?
Really important question again. So we would think, my suggestion would be that the Australian government has just released the AUKUS submarine industry strategy, and it had some important elements and initiatives in it, right from workforce, supply chains, opening up opportunities for the Australian industry. But I think there's a lot more work to be done in that space. Importantly, I think there is a difference in this context between the push and the pull. So the push in Australian industry context are things like grants and, helping, supporting small business and so forth. But the really big levers that government have to pull about leveraging that Australian capability are through things like the Australian Industry Capability Plans, through having a really detailed roadmap, again, about what we expect, having a real transparency in terms for the Australian public and defence industry about what we're asking in terms of the AUKUS submarine design and in terms of what the Australian industry requirements will be. So while we think that that strategy was a very good first step, what we're looking for now is really a detailed roadmap about how that's going to occur, what kind of pull capabilities rather than just push ones that we need to have, and a real vision, I suppose, as to how that's going to occur. And indeed, again, we have had the really serious funding put into the US and the UK industrial bases necessarily. We would be, in AI Group, would ask for a proportionate response into the Australian base to really be driving the serious resources we need to fund what is going to be a transformation for the industry in order to build and support those submarines.
And while submarines are quite complex beasts, and you would assume there'd be a lot of potential suppliers, it's not just submarines in AUKUS, it's the Pillar 2 arrangements as well. And that's really speaking to sort of an aspiration to integrate the 3 industrial bases between Australia, US and UK. I mean, are you a bit more hopeful there that we're doing enough to make sure that those connections are there between those 3 industries?
I certainly think the potential is there, and there is and has been a lot of excitement in the industrial base across all 3, UK, US and Australia, as to what the potential might be for those important domains about putting those disruptive capabilities into the Indo-Pacific, bringing those industrial bases together. And there's a couple of elements to that, Louise. First of all, there are the enablers, which you mentioned, which you have included the ITAR reforms, which have been a very important step change for all 3 industry bases. We have had the introduction of the Defence Trade Controls legislation, which we have been working through with Defence, and a lot of industry now understands the new requirements, which are important to know about and important for businesses to understand. There are also other enablers that I know are areas of focus, including security clearances and really clearing the way for the industry bases to work together. I think an important focus now needs to be on capability delivery, on forming projects, informing industry as to what the opportunities might be in the future, and clarity around whether AUKUS Pillar 2 is going to focus on joint procurements or on, focused domestic capability development, which we then export, or how it's actually going to be governed and how it's going to be delivered.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Kate. So while, of course, this is very much focused on the federal election that's coming up, in defence especially, it's such a global soup of issues that are affecting industry and our members and the work that we do. So thanks very much for joining me. And after the election, we might reconnect and have a look at what the new government's policies are in relation to defence.
Thanks very much, Louise.
Thanks.